What are they brewing about? Well, I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, and we're back on with a very interesting guest, Wakoh Shannon Hickey, and my co-host, David Forbes in Brooklyn. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you. It's sunny in Brooklyn right now.
Very good. So we're very fortunate to have Wakoh on with us today, and we'll be talking about her new book, The Mind Cure, How Meditation Became Medicine. But before we do that, we want to get familiar with Wakoh and her background. So maybe we could begin by, obviously you've been very interested in Buddhism and meditation. So how did that journey all start for you in that direction?
Well, I grew up in Northern California in the Napa Valley, and my parents appeared very conventional on the surface, but they were very broad-minded and intellectually curious people. And they named our cats after Hindu and Egyptian deities, and they read very widely and broadly. And I was raised in a mainline Protestant church and rebelled from their kind of liberality by joining a fundamentalist Protestant kind of Pentecostal church. And so I immersed myself in that, but they encouraged me to ask questions and think critically and all of that. And so you can't get very far into the Bible without running into questions. And I asked them in a snotty adolescent way. And I got formally shunned by this church when I was 15, which was a really actually devastating experience. But my dad loaned me a copy of the Tao Te Ching, and I copied it by hand into a notebook that I still have. And it was the first time the idea of non-duality had ever been presented to me, and it just blew my mind. So when I went to college, I went to college in Berkeley, and there was a Buddhist temple nearby. It was a Jodo Shinshu temple. And I kind of got interested, and I wandered in, and I practiced there for a while, but it was a little too similar to the kind of Protestant churches that I had left, which is ironic because of the whole history of how that came about. And Duncan Williams, by the way, I'm going to make a little plug for Duncan Williams' book, American Dharma, and his history of Buddhism in the internment camps and all of that is a painful and wonderful book I recommend. So I went to various Buddhist temples around Berkeley and settled into the Zen Center and kind of stuck with it. And later, I was working as a journalist. That was my first career after college, and I ended up covering a moral majority conference.
Oh wow!
And I'll spare you the whole story. It's quite a story, but it had a very profound effect on me, and it motivated me to take a semester out of college and go spend it at Green Gulch Farm, which is connected with San Francisco Center.
Yeah. And
during that time, I had an experience of non-separateness, shall we say, with something that seemed like the antithesis of me. The boundary dropped, and I saw that we were not separate, and that was a really pivotal moment for me. And that was the beginning, really, of my Buddhist trajectory. So I practiced it for many years, and I decided eventually to go to graduate school, and I wanted to go to a place where I could ask questions about the Bible and not get in trouble.
Yeah.
So I went to Pacific School of Religion, which is an ecumenical Protestant seminary that's part of the Graduate Theological Union. And that was my primary sort of academic home. And I did the kind of traditional Master of Divinity curriculum there. But I also took a lot of my major coursework at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. So I basically ended up with a master's degree in Buddhist and Christian studies and a Master of Divinity. And during the MDiv program, I did a residency as a hospital chaplain and loved it, but decided to go and do a PhD. So I went to Duke and did a PhD in religion and modernity. And my fields are basically American religious history, Buddhism in East Asia and the West, religion and medicine, and basically interfaith dialogue, particularly Buddhist-Christian dialogue. And after I taught for 10 years, 5 at Alfred University, which is in Western New York, and then at Notre of Maryland in Baltimore. Taught religious studies in a wide variety of courses, and then last summer, decided that I really needed to come home to California. My father had died, and I really wanted to come home to California, so I came back to the Napa Valley, and am currently working per diem as a chaplain for Hospice by the Bay, which is a second oldest hospice in the United States and one of the largest, the oldest and largest in California. And there was one other thing I was going to mention, but I can't remember offhand, so I'll stop talking.
You became a Sōtō Zen priest at some point.
Right, that's right. So I worked as a journalist for a long time and editor and did editorial projects, and I got injured on the keyboard. I got a repetitive strain injury. Yeah. And I was fired. Oh. And I was in the workers' comp system, and I was retrained. It was at the very beginning of the development of voice recognition technology. Mm-hmm. And so I learned how to sort of program voice recognition systems, and I taught people with disabilities how to use them when they were in their infancy. And the company that I worked for was great, but then it went out of business. And so I was at a crossroads in my life, and I wasn't sure what to do next. So I went off to Tassajara Monastery and got really quiet and clarified that what I wanted to do was go back to school and study religion and explore the possibility of ordination, which had never really interested me before. I've been practicing as a lay person for years. I mean, I've been practicing Zen for, 35 years. But ordination had never interested me until it was sort of the only thing to do. And so I went to seminary, as part of that, and was also preparing for ordination. And basically at the end of my seminary, I was ordained by a Japanese teacher and trained with him for many years, and then kind of came back to the San Francisco Zen Center community, and my current teacher is there. But I was ordained in 2003, just before I went off to do my PhD, and I did my head monk training in 2010.
Wow, quite a rich and varied background. Well, I was mentioning to David earlier that your article, Meditation as Medicine, a Critique, was one of the first papers I read that was a critique of the mindfulness movement, particularly MBSR. And that really led me on my own journey of digging into the rhetoric and basically kind of having a critical perspective on what was going on. So I really thank you for that.
Yeah.
And so let's turn to your new book, because it's so rich, and there's so much I think unknown history, especially to people, I would say, to most Western Buddhists and people in the mindfulness movement. The title of the book, again, is The Mind Cure: How Meditation Became Medicine, published by Oxford University Press just earlier this month, so it's hot off the press. Mm-hmm. And so you basically, one of the first things that stood out for me immediately is that you're really telling kind of the untold history of meditation. Because I think a lot of people assume that, Zen and meditation kind of started in the early 60s and 70s, right?
Right.
And so what you do in this book, I think, is saying, oh, no, that's not exactly true. And so what interested you into going back into this early 19th century history?
Right, because you had said to us earlier that this book has been in the works for a long time for you. So we'd like to know how it came about.
Yeah. So my master's thesis is actually longer than my dissertation, and my master's thesis really had to do with clergy formation in the United States, and I did a cross-cultural and kind of interreligious comparison between the way that clergy are trained in Japan, in the United States, Buddhist clergy in Japan and the United States, and Protestant clergy in the American religious mainstream. And I was looking at the issue of teacher misconduct, sexual misconduct, and all that. And one of my professors said to me, do you really want to spend the next 5 years of your academic career and beyond writing about this topic, or do you want to do something different? So I thought, well, I'll try something different. So my advisor suggested, well, what about something about mindfulness? So I was thinking about that, and I was also taking courses in 19th century American religious history. And I remember the moment standing in the stacks in the Duke Divinity Library, in the bowels of the library, and I'm looking at these books about New Thought and Christian Science, and I go, hey, this sounds really familiar to me.
Yeah.
And there's something here, and I had a hunch that there was a connection. And so I was able to trace the history kind of from the 17th century European Enlightenment up to about World War I, and then from about 1950 on. But I couldn't make the connections. I didn't have the evidence to show that there were connections that spanned this period between, World War I and World War II. I didn't know what was going on in there. And so I couldn't make an argument in my dissertation that there was a historical connection. I just didn't have the evidence. And so what I did in my dissertation was look at these two movements and say, hey, there's some interesting parallels. And mindfulness has all the marks of American metaphysical religion, and et cetera. And then after I finished my PhD, I continued to think about this. And this story is kind of amazing. I just really want to tell it and give a shout out to Allison Stokes. I was a candidate for a job at the University of Rochester that a scholar and a chaplain named Allison Stokes got instead of me. She was more qualified. But I happened to get a job about an hour and a half away at Alfred University in Alfred, New York. And I decided to meet Allison because we had common interests. So I went to meet her, and then she asked me to be on the board of an interfaith organization that she founded, which was about 2 hours from where I lived. So to attend a board meeting, I went to her home and spent the night in her home, and she was telling me about research that she had done years before at Yale. And I went, oh my God, that's the missing link. And so Allison's book helped me to connect the dots from the early Mindfulness movement to the contemporary mindfulness movement by pointing me to a movement called the Emmanuel movement, which was really the pivot, and early connections, early interest, psychological interest in meditation and psychosomatic illness and mental healing.
Right. Yeah. There's so many strands that you trace in this book, and just show really incredibly the complex, various influences of various figures like Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science, and many others. But perhaps maybe you can give us a little bit of a kind of an overview of how do you characterize, or what is the New Thought movement? Are you using the mind cure movement and New Thought synonymously, or are there some differences in those two terminologies?
Let me go back a little further. Okay, so there was a guy in the. I'm gonna pass over that. There's an interesting history in Europe in the 18th century involving a doctor named Franz Anton Mesmer, who was the founder of mesmerism,
right,
and a scientist and mystic named Emanuel Swedenborg, and their ideas. And so I trace how their ideas converge. Ultimately, they're trying to understand the nature of the mind and the soul and consciousness, and their ideas sort of converged in the work of a fellow named Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. And Quimby was the first guy in the United States to sort of really figure out that there's a relationship between our beliefs or mental states and our physical health. And he developed a method of sort of mental cure that he called the science of health and happiness. And he taught it to many people. And he had a little mind cure clinic. And it seems that his method was something like sort of hypnotic suggestion.
Uh-huh.
And he was, credited with many, many, many cures. And one of his primary students was Mary Baker Eddy. And another of his students was a guy named Warren Felt Evans, who was a Swedenborgian minister who was also interested in Buddhism and Hinduism and these Asian religions that people were just beginning to have access to. White European Americans were just beginning to have access to in the 19th century from translations by Buddhist scholars and so forth. So there was Warren Felt Evans and Mary Baker Eddy and Annetta and Julius Dresser were these major students of Quimby's. And they went out and started teaching various mind cure methods themselves. And there was a big fight between Eddy and some of the others. She later renounced Quimby, claimed that she had a unique revelation that came to her from God, and she developed her own school and her own method in her own church called the Church of First Church of Christ Scientists.
Christ Scientists, Christian Science.
Yeah, which is still around. Yes.
Right. And the other folks, the other students of Quimby's, went on and were much more eclectic in their interests. They were interested in theosophy. They were interested in other kinds of Western esotericism. They were interested in Buddhism and Hinduism. And they also developed kind of methods of mental therapeutics like affirmations, or methods called mental photography, where you would gaze at an image for a long time to sort of imprint it in your mind, and prayer and meditation on the breath and
also,
etc.
Medical clairvoyance was also part of that too.
Yeah, Quimby he started out as basically a traveling mesmerist. He was a clockmaker who became a traveling mesmerist. And he was on stage with a guy named Lucius Berkmar. And Berkmar was supposedly a medical clairvoyant, and he'd go into a trance state and be able to supposedly diagnose people's illnesses and prescribe cures. And Quimby, his success rate was mixed. And at one point, he prescribed something that was just absurd, and it worked. And Quimby figured out basically that what was going on was that the person believed that it was going to work. That was the key. And so he quit working with Lucius Berkmar and went out on his own and developed this method. So medical clairvoyance is a part of the 19th century background history to interest in mental therapeutics.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Emmanuel movement as being a real key influence. Can you say more about what that was, and was it in Boston mostly, as you point out in the book?
It became national. Started in Boston and became national. So, kind of looping back to your earlier question about Christian Science and mind cure and what those terms mean.
Yeah.
I distinguish. There's Christian Science is quite a distinct religious denomination. New Thought is a really diffuse, eclectic movement that includes some denominations, and today they include Unity, the Unity School of Christianity, Divine Science, Religious Science, or the Centers for Spiritual Living, Seicho no Ie, which is a Japanese denomination, Foundation for Better Living. So there are these sort of denominational things, but then there's also this whole big, loose, diffuse network of people and ideas that kind of fall into this category. And so there's Christian Science and New Thought, and in their early days, they were sort of, the boundaries between them were very permeable.
Yeah.
And collectively, I call them the mind cure movement.
At this point, does it make sense to begin to talk about the kind of split that you mentioned in your book between more individualistic movements and more communal ones? Is this?
Yes. Yeah. So we've got the early mind cure movement, and for many of the people who were practicing it were women, particularly, middle and upper middle class white women in this Victorian period. And women were having a lot of symptoms that were called hysterical. We would now call it stress related. And they lived very confined lives in certain respects. And they got interested in New Thought and mind cure, and they realized that not only if they could change their minds, the way they thought, they could actually change their circumstances. And so many of these women were captivated by the idea that if you could change your mind, you could change your circumstances. And they went out and they developed and magazines, and they became preachers, and they established seminaries and ordained women as ministers and worked as counselors. They created all of these possibilities, the mind cure movement, for these women, and they were also interested in various kinds of social reform movements like marriage reform, voting rights, prevention of cruelty to animals, prison reform. They were involved in all of these kinds of social things, and they got really interested in Buddhism and Hinduism after the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago. That was the first time that Asian missionaries came to the United States and talked to, white audiences about their religions. And these New Thought women were really interested, and they sponsored tours by these missionaries all around the country. Soen Shaku, Anagarika Dharmapala, Swami Vivekananda. They sponsored these tours, and they learned basically Raja Yoga and mindfulness of breathing and the 4 foundations of mindfulness, etc. These teachers, and they incorporated it into their practice. And they form what I call the community-oriented kind of wing of the
the community-oriented wing of the mind cure movement, or New Thought,
movement, yeah.
And it sounds it sounds like it was very empowering, especially that they were so intent on social activism. You also mentioned too that that African Americans had their own sort of strand of this that became very empowering for them. Is that true?
Yeah, the Unity School of Christianity and some of these early women mind cure teachers inspired African American men, mostly men, to also kind of develop movements that were designed to empower people who had been really subjugated by white supremacy and Jim Crow. And so a number of African American religious movements were inspired by New Thought, and they include Moorish science, the Nation of Islam, Black Hebrew Israelite movements. There's a whole bunch of connections that we can trace between these African American religious movements and the early the women sort of dominated New Thought movement. But the people who were writing books and histories were basically the white men, and another strand of the New Thought movement went in a very individualistic direction, in the direction of individual prosperity and business success. And so we get, Napoleon Hill saying, think and grow rich.
Yeah.
Dale Carnegie saying, make friends and influence people. And there's that whole kind of individualist wing of the New Thought movement. And that's where I would place the contemporary mindfulness movement. So I trace those histories. And now to come back to the Emmanuel movement. I know I know I'm going along kind of way round, but that's the challenge of this story, is that there's so many connections and interwoven histories. So,
I just want to make a quick comment. I was, as you were speaking earlier about Victorian women who suffered from hysteria. I mean, I might have missed a passing reference in your book to Freud, but Freud obviously was very individualistic, and he worked with, in particular, with cases of women who had hysteria, and that's another male who chose an individualistic approach to around the same time that you're describing these.
Yeah, you're getting just slightly ahead of me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. My bad.
But you're just slightly ahead of me. So the women-dominated, community-oriented mind cure movement was enormously successful, and they were. I mean, it was spread through Good Housekeeping and popular media. It was really booming around the turn of the 20th century. And so was Christian Science, man. They were raking in money hand over fist and building these huge edifices, and super popular, right? And mainstream Orthodox medicine at that time relied on bloodletting and leeches and clitorectomies.
No. Oh, God, it's terrible.
Yeah. Cauterizing people and blistering and horrible things that killed people. When cholera outbreaks happened, this kind of medicine did not help. The mind curers and people who were developing other kinds of alternative medicine killed fewer people and were quite, were less horrifying. Yeah. And so they were really popular.
That's their motto. We kill fewer people.
All right.
And they had a big impact on the society. So essentially, right down the road from the first church of Christian Science in Boston was an Episcopal church run by Elwood Worcester, who had been trained in scientific psychology in Germany. And so he was both an Episcopal priest and trained as a psychologist, and so was his associate pastor. And they thought that Christian Science was, bad medicine and bad religion, and they wanted to stop it. And they wanted to promote scientific psychology and, more traditional religion. And they teamed up with some neurologists and psychologists from Tufts and from University of Massachusetts and et cetera, and they formed a clinic, and it was basically the first social services and group therapy clinic in the country. So people would come in and they'd get evaluated by doctors. They started out treating people with tuberculosis, how to care for themselves if they couldn't go off to an expensive sanitarium. And they taught classes in hygiene, and they formed small group sessions, and they began to treat people who were dealing with alcoholism in small peer groups, and they had weekly kind of healing services that people could come to that were kind of ecumenical. And so they had this whole sort of big clinic that was combining essentially pastoral counseling, what we would now call pastoral counseling, and medical care and kind of group therapy. And they were also socially oriented, community oriented. And so they would bring a kind of a team approach, a doctor and a sort of a social worker and a pastor, a chaplain, you might say, all together. We're trying to kind of help people as whole people deal with them body, mind, and spirit. And it was very successful, and it got a lot of publicity. They wrote a very popular book about it and got a lot of press. And some people started to get really upset about it. Some doctors thought they shouldn't be messing in religion, and that and some clergy thought that clergy who weren't trained as psychologists shouldn't be, trying to do therapy, and people wanted to kind of keep the boundaries straight. And some sensational press, claimed that Worcester was raising people from the dead, which of course he wasn't. And so the Emmanuel movement kind of went underground. And nevertheless, it inspired a number of people who went on to pioneer in the fields of psychosomatic medicine, group psychotherapy, addiction treatment, etc. And all of this was actually before Freud ever came to the United States. This all started in 1906. Freud's first visit to the United States was in 1909, but he then became a very dominant influence. And of course, he was very atheistic in his approach, and so these religious approaches really kind of were shoved to the side. So the Emmanuel movement was sort of the pivot point where these mental therapeutic techniques got kind of taken out of the hands of the women and the sort of religious communities and channeled into scientific psychology and orthodox medicine.
Right, and that's
which was male dominated.
Yes, white men with elite academic credentials.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of a turning point, perhaps the appropriation of the term science for the legitimation of that movement. You also mentioned that there were differences between the community ministry, which was you characterize it as affective versus noetic. And the noetic side was all about, as you said, like prosperity gospel, and it sounded like it was almost a precursor to the self-help movement in many ways.
Well, those terms, affective and noetic, come from Gary Ward Matera, who wrote a doctoral dissertation about the early women-dominated mind cure movement. And he used those terms to distinguish between the wing of the movement that was dominated by women, that was centered in religious communities, that tended to meet during the daytime, that had these kind of spiritual concerns and community concerns, and the sort of male-dominated wing that was more intellectual, more prosperity-oriented. And I decided that affective and noetic as categories tend to using them in this way tends to reinforce the stereotype that women are emotional and men are intellectual.
Yeah.
And there were women on the noetic side and men on the affective side. So I think that better terms are community-oriented new thought or mind cure, and individualist or prosperity-oriented mind cure. And I think the individualist mind cure is sort of a foundation of the new age and self-help movements, and prosperity gospel and that kind of thing is it another sort of outgrowth of this individualist approach to mind cure, that it's just your mind and not so much the wider circle of concern.
Right. I lived in Tulsa, believe it or not, for about a year, and I remember driving by Oral Roberts University.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
My one of my cousins is a graduate of that university.
Ah. So William James was also a figure early on, and he seemed like he was getting his feet wet with all this too. Is that right?
Yeah, he in his the Gifford Lectures that became The Varieties of Religious Experience, that kind of classic book.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about the religion of health-mindedness.
The religion of healthy-mindedness, yeah.
And he also talks about the term. is escaping me, but a kind of religious individual who goes through a real sort of struggle before kind of having the twice born. That's what he called them. And Mary Baker Eddy was an example of that kind of religiosity. And then he talked about the religion of healthy mindfulness, the healthy mindedness, which was all about sort of cheerfulness and happiness. And he associated that sort of with the New Thought movement, and he was interested in what they were talking about. And when the American Medical Association was trying to basically squash these mental healing movements that they didn't control, he actually defended them and said, we could learn something from these mind cures. They're actually doing something that mainstream medicine isn't doing, and they actually have something to offer. But the Orthodox medicine was really trying to define itself and police its borders and regulate who was practicing and all that kind of stuff. So licensing laws were ways of trying to squash alternative medical systems.
Yeah, what I find fascinating is that you're basically showing that there were like 100 years prior to the mindfulness movement that these figures were advocating daily meditation. Even
yes.
Certainly, that turning point was that 1893 World Parliament of Religion meeting that you mentioned. So what happened after that? I mean, we see all these people like, as you mentioned, Shoin Shaku, and later D.T. Suzuki came in. And what was happening at that time, and what was the significance of that particular period?
So 1893, thank you for that question.
Yeah.
1893 was the World Parliament of Religions, and that was the first time, as I said, that kind of white Americans got to meet Zen Buddhists and Hindus and other kinds of Buddhists, etc., and learn about meditation. And there was a woman named Sarah Farmer who did not attend the Parliament, but was really inspired by the Parliament, who owned some land in Maine. And so she set up a conference and retreat center called Greenacre. And she invited people like these missionaries like Sōtō Shaku and D.T. Suzuki and Swami Vivekananda and Anagarika Dharmapala and Paul Karras and other people who were kind of early people interested in Buddhism and Buddhist art and other religions as well. So there was a strong Vedanta presence at Greenacre, and they set up a school of comparative religions. And every summer they'd have this summer season of conferences and workshops and etc. And that was where New Thought people and these Asian Buddhist missionaries converged. And the Asian Buddhist missionaries were trying to argue that they were coming from countries that had been affected by British colonialism. Many of them were familiar with and had been educated in various kinds of Christianity. And they were basically using science to critique Christianity and colonialism. They were critiquing colonialism in an effort to kind of promote their own religious traditions.
Right.
And they were very successful at it. And it was a time when Darwin's discoveries about natural selection and so forth were causing people to question the literal account of creation in the Bible and all of that. And so there was great interest in Buddhism at that time. And so that was the sort of a meeting ground, and it lasted for a number of years. Eventually, Sarah Farmer joined the Baha'i movement, and Greenacre became a Baha'i school. But that was where some of this interest really began and kind of got seeded. And then there were all of these Asian exclusion laws in the United States. And so it became harder but not impossible, to have access to teachers who could teach meditation and yoga and so forth. Meanwhile, the Mind Cure movement is developing, and then the Emmanuel movement emerges, and then the Emmanuel movement kind of goes underground and inspires a woman named Helen Flanders Dunbar, who becomes a pioneer in psychosomatic medicine, and other people who are interested in the connections between religion and health. And so some organizations in New York form that allow people to, talk about these issues, like a group called the New York Psychology Group, and which included Freudian psychologists who were then, by that point, fleeing Hitler's Germany and coming to the United States and teaching at Columbia, and people from Union Theological Seminary. And so people like Paul Tillich and Eric Fromm and Karen Horney and Ruth Benedict and I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. All of these psychologists and theologians are kind of talking at Columbia, and lo and behold, D.T. Suzuki comes back in 1950s, decades after he had first taught at Green Gulch, and begins teaching Zen, and Buddhism at Columbia.
Yeah.
And then a number of these psychologists start taking his classes, and they get interested. And then he writes this book on Zen psychotherapy with Eric Fromm.
Eric Fromm.
Yeah.
And then Esalen, Michael Murphy at Esalen begins to get interested in this stuff. And then in the 60s, this interest converges in, as I say, in places like Esalen and at Columbia University, and these conversations keep happening. And then when we lift the anti-Asian immigration law in 1965, then more missionaries come over and begin to spread things like transcendental meditation and happy, healthy, holy, and those kinds of city yoga, and then interest kind of explodes, and all of that is the precursor to Jon Kabat-Zinn and the modern mindfulness movement.
Yeah, I think you one of the chapters is mindfulness religion. I think that's where you begin to take a closer look at the modern mindfulness movement.
Right.
I think one of the incredible contributions you've made is to deconstruct the rhetorical strategies that Jon Kabat-Zinn and MBSR folks have used to stake their claims that that MBSR is transhistorical and transcultural, and universal. To me, can you open that up a bit for us? I mean, what did you see going on when you first came across this?
Well,
how do you make sense of it?
The first time I ever encountered Jon Kabat-Zinn was when I was in monastic training in a monastic ongo at Tassajara Zen Monastery, and he was a guest. And he came in and spoke to us, and we were like deep in, we were halfway through this monastic ongo meditating, 10 hours a day. Mm-hmm. And so it was this really intense atmosphere, and he comes in and he's a little blown away by it. But I remember his talk, and he was sincere about wanting to find a way to make available to people tools that he had found in his practice of Buddhism and yoga to be really helpful and transformative. And he wanted to make them accessible to people who wouldn't necessarily walk into a meditation hall or do an ongo or any of that. And I think that is his sincere desire.
Right.
And he has been influenced by a lot of different people and teachers, but basically kind of a number of modern Buddhist teachers and Neo-Vedanta teachers. And he's developed an understanding of the Dharma that I think is inclusive and sincere. And he wanted to explain it in a way that wouldn't scare away people disinterested in Asian religion, and it wouldn't scare away medical providers. So he found non-religious language to talk about stuff in. And so he ended up in certain contexts, he would talk about mindfulness is basically just paying attention in a particular way in the present moment and non-judgmental. That's all it is, kind of thing. And he'd use all of these terms that were sort of secular, non-religious terms. And then when he talked to Buddhist audiences, he said, "Basically, I'm teaching Buddhist meditation." And the deeper I looked, the more, I probed. He really, I think, he thinks that mindfulness teacher. He has said that mindfulness teachers should have a deep grounding in Buddhist meditation, even if they aren't talking in Buddhist terms when they're teaching mindfulness. He thinks that people need to understand, the two truths, the relative and absolute, and the teaching of no self, and the teaching of impermanence, and sort of fundamental Buddhist teaching underlie his whole approach. And I happen to share those beliefs. I mean, I'm a Buddhist.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's sort of disingenuous to say that you have to speak, but there's no connection to religion here. There's no connection to Buddhism. And he says, Buddhism is great, but what I really care about is the Dharma, which is a statement I find incoherent.
Yes.
Right. So do we.
The Dharma. Yep.
Right. And I think that he has basically conflated his own particular historically situated interpretation of Buddhism and Dharma, and claims that it's this universal thing that applies everywhere. And that's a kind of a colonial way of thinking that I dispute. I disagree with.
Yeah, it's almost as if MBSR is a one-stop shop for the entire Buddha Dharma.
Well, yes, I heard that part of the conversation that you were having with previous guests. That, yes, that if he's sort of saying that the teachings in mindfulness are sort of equivalent to, if not coextensive with, the Buddha Dharma. I think that's
that's his claim. Yeah. Can you say something about the ethics issue?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think that early on, when he was first doing like the one-day retreats that are part of the MBSR program, he would ask people to observe the 5 basic Buddhist precepts. And that was a feature, I think, of the early MBSR courses. But then I think that fell away or became sort of optional. And so MBSR teaches basic meditation and yoga techniques and other kinds of techniques to help people examine their stress responses and begin to shift them and all of that. And I think it's very helpful. I mean, I don't want to say don't do it. But bring me back to my question again.
Well, there's a conflict or a controversy around ethics. I mean, the argument is, Buddhism has not only ethical precepts, but it has a kind of an ethical or moral worldview, and MBSR seems to have jettisoned that, and or he kind of trusts that the instructor is going to embody that, and leaves it up to the instructor.
It's up to the individual, and ethics are built into the practice, and we got the Hippocratic Oath, so we're covered. We're covered.
Right, that's enough.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that reflects the kind of psychotherapeutic approach of kind of value neutral counseling, and in Buddhism, the foundation of meditation is moral conduct. Mm-hmm. Shila, moral conduct, the precepts are the basis of meditation, which are the basis of wisdom and compassion, and they are all in Buddhist thought mutually reinforcing. And I think that Kabat-Zinn has kind of talked about the ethical responsibility of the teacher, but there's nothing about the ethical or communal cultivation of the student. So I participated in a couple of MBSR classes, and I experienced them firsthand, and I witnessed other people going through them, and they are very helpful. But they're basically, the format was we'd get in a circle, and we'd be facing the teacher, and the teacher would instruct us in various things. And when we had discussions, they were pretty much discussions with the teacher. So we didn't really interact with each other. Community didn't really form sort of outside this little container, and then when the class ended 8 weeks later, people just sort of dispersed.
Right. Yeah, I experienced that too. I took an MBSR course as well, and that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so so there wasn't any. And I think one of the other sort of ethical issues is that more research is finding that meditation also can have negative effects.
Yes. Willoughby Britton.
Yeah.
Negative effects of meditation. Meditation is absolutely positively counterindicated in certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you shouldn't be trying to teach people with psychosis to meditate, and for some people who are really depressed, it's not helpful. And when you do intensive meditation, all kinds of stuff can come up, and if the teacher's not equipped to deal with that, then real harm is possible.
Yes.
So those are other kind of ethical issues, and so the training of teachers and all of that. And I also want to say that although I really when I was living in Baltimore, there's a wonderful organization called the Holistic Life Foundation, and it was founded by men of color who are working with students in the poorest, most underserved schools in Baltimore. And he was teaching them how to manage their they were teaching them how to manage their emotions and handle stress and deal with conflict using kind of mindfulness and yoga techniques. And I think that that's a really great thing. And I mean, it really makes a difference. And I think that the critics who say, well, but people need to be transparent about the religious roots of this and have informed consent and all of that, I think they have a fair critique that needs to be heard.
Another area that we find a lot of overlap in your book with how we see things is you make the point that there's very little or no systemic analysis of suffering,
right,
from the MBSR point of view.
Right.
I also appreciate the work of the Holistic Foundation in Baltimore, but one of my concerns is I'm interested in taking that even further, which would be to help the students as part of a kind of a social mindfulness, which some of us talk about, is to bring in an analysis of why they are suffering, or why they are angry, or why they are alienated, and to use mindfulness the way Funi Su talks about, to interrogate and to look at what's happening in their lives as social beings. But in terms of your book, you had a very trenchant critique of some of the concerns about how MBSR just doesn't really even look at that.
Well, it's not designed for it, for one thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not designed for it. So I think one of the issues that I'd like to come back to a really key issue, I think, that maybe goes to the heart of a lot of these issues, and it's I like to call it the one big audacious blind spot. Is that, and this goes for even Western Buddhists too, but particularly MBSR and mindfulness, is that they don't actually want to own up to their own cultural and historical situatedness, and they take this universal stance that somehow we stand outside of our culture, and so therefore we have this kind of authentic essence that we could tap into, which is void of so-called cultural baggage and so forth.
Right, and I think in part that's because, like, Jon Kabat-Zinn is a microbiologist. He's not a scholar of religious studies. This whole strand of this kind of perennialist idea that there's this universal core to religions that's transcultural and transhistoric, that has a particular history, and it's very influential in people of Kabat-Zinn's and my and perhaps your generation.
Yeah, right? And the transcendentalists that were in New England too, as well. Right. Yeah. The
transcendentalists, the theosophists. I mean, all of these threads. That kind of idea has a really interesting modern history, and it's all tied up with colonialism and all kinds of stuff. But anyway, that notion, that kind of perennialist approach that also is people like Houston Smith, who was a hugely popularizer of comparative religion.
And I think John Kabat-Zinn took a class with him at MIT.
Yeah?
I think I read about that somewhere, yeah.
And Mircea Eliade and all of these people, they kind of try to do that, and they have been critiqued over the last, 40 years within the sort of the academy, but I'm not sure that those critiques have necessarily made their way out into the culture at large. And also, he's coming from a scientific perspective, and the Western scientific worldview also presumes that it is transcultural and transhistoric, and universal. And there are certain ways in which it is. I mean, math is math, but physics is physics, but there are also ways in which Western science is culturally and historically situated. And, so I think that's part of why he does that. And so I'm coming at it from a religious studies point of view and critiquing it. And I want to just say one more thing.
Yeah.
The basic critique of the book, the basic argument of the book is that when we go from mind cure, the early mind cure movement, to the contemporary mindfulness movement, three things have gotten lost in translation. Okay, so the three things that have gotten lost in this process from mind cure to mindfulness are the community orientation of these practices, the ethical foundation of these practices, as you have raised, and then the ability to think systemically about suffering. Because if you're suffering and stress, and your stress-related illnesses are all about your individual psychological approach to the world, then we don't have to look at the ways that racism and poverty and homophobia and et cetera, systemic factors, capitalism, fuel stress-related illness and mortality and morbidity. So that's the basic argument.
Yeah, and I think you make that argument very well in that last chapter on what got lost.
Yeah.
But if we look at the mindfulness movement as a form of capitalist spirituality, I think one of the key things that I take away from your book is, there are social and revolutionary aspects of religion. Now, religion is not some angel out there that, it has its issues, but there's something that's been suppressed, or it's just got dominated by the scientific Western universal sort of stance, right? What happened in the early mind cure movement, as you mentioned in the book, with women who were highly involved in politics and fighting for economic justice and all kinds of things like that. For some reason, I mean, what do you see happening now? I mean, are we at a point where we can reclaim that kind of strand and reinvigorate that sort of social side of mindfulness?
And I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. And I, historically speaking, Buddhism has not had a real revolutionary social critique. That's just not been its project.
No, right.
Not at all. Yeah. Nope. David Loy is right on that point too. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that in an email you asked me, Ron, about this, and I think that the socially engaged Buddhism, the efforts of people like Alan Senauke today, and Bhikkhu Bodhi, and Shaolin Hu, and others, to kind of articulate a Buddhist social ethic, is a product. Actually, it's a positive outgrowth of the interaction between Buddhism and the major theistic traditions, all of which have a strong social justice component.
Yeah, the Abrahamic traditions. Yeah.
Yeah, but not just. I mean, the Sikh tradition as well. Very strong social justice concern, and a lot of parallels with that kind of thing. But so I think that that's a very fruitful outgrowth, and I think that it begins to address a kind of a lacuna in Buddhism, because I think some strands of Buddhism are very world denying and say you just have to get really sick and tired of samsara to motivate you to practice to get out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, transcendent sort of escapism.
Yeah, and I think that my understanding of kind of Mahayana teaching is that samsara and nirvana are the same place, and what shifts is your perspective. And so you remain, so quote unquote, in samsara to try to help alleviate suffering with a transformed consciousness.
But I think you also make a good point, though, that that mindfulness in and of itself is probably completely insufficient to bring about the kind of social and political transformation that we need in this era that we're in, and that compassion and moral conduct are actually aspects that actually need their own forms of cultivation, and that meditation alone may not be sufficient for this kind of broader concern for political and social and environmental justices.
Yeah, you're very clear in your book at the end that we all and we agree that we have to change the structural, systemic, institutional power relations as well in society.
Yeah, I think that there are many people who believe and who argue that like spiritual awakening
is sufficient.
Dramatically produces wisdom and compassion.
Yeah, correct. No.
But I don't think so. I think that there's both kind of these moments of sudden illumination that are powerful, but also Buddhism is a path of cultivation, ethical cultivation as well as spiritual cultivation. And this morning I was reading a book of Catholic prayers, and because I'm working as a chaplain and I deal with Catholic patients, and I was reading about how the sort of Catholic Church understands the life of prayer, and it was very much this practice of sort of sacralizing everyday life through liturgical practices, prayer, devotion, and these kinds of things. And that's exactly what I found in Zen training to be really transformative. Is this sort of liturgical practice, the physical practice of devotion and bowing and so forth, to sort of sacralize ordinary life and cultivate me, as a person who has certain ideals and aspirations that I keep coming back to even when I fail. And that's a much more kind of comprehensive kind of formation than am I less stressed at work so that I can cope with my 12-hour day.
Wait, it's a totally different project, yes.
Yes. Right. So, teaching people to be mindful in itself is not a bad thing, but as you say, and I say, it's not the whole picture.
No.
But I think that people like Candy Gunther Brown have a fair critique when they say, yeah, but if we're promoting these religious worldviews, then we should just be upfront about what we're doing.
Oh, yeah.
And give people a choice.
Yeah, informed consent.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing, I think, maybe the point you just made about the Catholic prayers kind of brings up for me that, I think one of the weaknesses of the mindfulness movement is it doesn't see the practice itself as being embedded within a community of practice.
Right.
It's like the community of practice is in itself part of that spiritual formation that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, it's individualistic.
And so, I mean, if we look at the civil rights movement, just the religious impulse behind that, motivated by a social justice agenda, and then that sort of fades out somehow and becomes privatized spirituality.
Yeah. Or liberation theology.
Right. There are strands out there, but it seems like if we're in a cultural translation project for Western Buddhism, it seems like that why can't we learn from these other strands, such as liberation theology and other more socially engaged types of movements?
Yeah. Hang on. I just had it's a fee for service model.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fee-for-service model. It's
a therapeutic model. It's therapeutic.
Yeah, it's a therapeutic model, and it's also a medical model.
Yeah, medical. Yeah.
That's right. Right. Right.
And because it has to fit into that system to even gain access to potential students.
Yeah, and you make the point that one of the reasons why these critiques that have been launched against the mindfulness movement, they haven't really taken hold because perhaps they really don't need to worry about it. Most people that are doing mindfulness are white, elite, affluent people. They have better access to medical care to begin with, right? They have the affordances and privileges. And to be an MBSR teacher, it's going to run you about $10,000, right?
Yes.
And Search Inside Yourself, right? That's about $7,500. Wisdom 2.0 is another $1,500 to attend, and then there's you mentioned there's a leadership conference in the Bahamas, and
it's a booming business. It's a booming sort of industry, and and so I think that as I say, I don't think that we shouldn't teach people to be more self-aware and reflexive and present in their lives and present to other people. Yes, we should.
Yeah.
But this is really a booming business, and I think that the main purveyors and also the main consumers tend to be affluent white people, because you have to have money to buy the stuff, and you have to have time in your life to
time's a whole nother factor, right?
Yeah, say I'm a woman, with 2 kids, raising them by myself, working, 3 jobs. When am I going to have 2 hours to do meditation and yoga?
Or a 10-day insight meditation retreat, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So where do you see yourself going from here? I mean, this book is out. We're hoping it gets really good publicity, which I think it will. And it's a beautiful contribution of scholarship to the field of religious studies. I've learned a tremendous amount and really helped me open up the connections that I didn't see before. And,
glad.
So where do you see yourself going from here?
Well, it's kind of coming out at an interesting time, because I'm making this shift in terms of how I make my living. I'm working as a chaplain, and that's a very different kind of work, but I love it. I mean, it's really, I think I'm well suited to it. It's good. I'm also trying to stay active, though, in scholarly circles. I'm on the steering committees of a couple of units at the American Academy of Religion. And we've been vetting and choosing proposals for panels for the annual meeting. And I'm hoping that my book will be featured on 1, maybe 2 panels. And I'll have a chance to talk about it at the AAR.
I'm hoping to go this year. Where is it this year?
San Diego.
Oh, I think I will go. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's just down the coast.
Yeah. Well, good. We'll be able to meet then.
Yes, exactly. Well, gosh, I could come have lunch with you in San Francisco sometime.
Oh yeah, easily. We should plan for that. That'd be fun.
Or if you'd like to come up to the Napa Valley.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Do some wine tasting.
Yes, certainly. But anyway, so that's the next thing, and I'm just beginning to kind of try to get the word out about it. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about it. I hope I haven't taken you in too many confusing circles.
Oh, not at all.
No, this was great.
I mean, there were so many threads that we didn't even pick up on. I mean, there's so much in this book that we didn't even do it justice in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you, Wakoh, and for joining us on the Mindful Cranks. We really enjoyed it. I hope